How are you doing? All right, there's so many people here. It's really exciting. So I am so excited to be here to talk to you about design and open source. And that was a great introduction. This is who I am on the internet. I'm just at Una. That's my handle. You can find me on GitHub, Twitter, CodePen, etc. As you heard, I work at Bustle Digital Group as the director of product design. I'm also a Google developer expert in web technologies. I have a podcast that's every other week called Tools Day about tech tools, tips, and tricks. So if you're interested in that, there's a bunch of episodes about various front-end dev things online. And I also started to explore other platforms. I've recently started an Instagram where I'm doing illustrations and mnemonic devices about web development concepts. I was also a core member of the Open Design Foundation that tried to increase designers and open source, and that's what I'm here to talk to you all about today. And while I was preparing for this talk, I was wondering how much did other people value design and open source? It was important to me, but I wanted to hear about how much other people valued this too. So I turned to Twitter, as one does, and I ran a little poll, and I asked, how important is design and open source? Just an open-ended question. And most people, 69%, said it's very important, design is key. Only 4% said, meh, it just needs to work. So I was so excited to see that so many people value design and open source so much as I did. And so I'm excited to be here also at this conference full of people who work on open source and also value design. So I want to get a little feel for the demographics of this audience as well. And I want to get a show of hands of how many people here are designers or developers. So before we get into this, let's practice. I want everyone here to raise your hand. Everybody raise your hands. I want to see everyone's hands up. OK, now wave them. Hi, this is so nice. Anyway, put your hands down. How many of you here consider yourselves developers who work in open source? OK, so that's literally almost everyone in this room. It's crazy to see so many hands up. What about designers here? Are there any designers here? Yeah, I see a couple. So there's a whole design UI UX track, which is really exciting to see. So I see a few out here. How many of you here work on open source full-time or as a part of your job? You get part of the time to work on open source. You get paid to work on open source from someone, your employer. Cool. What about designers here? Do you get paid to work on open source? Are you full-time open source? OK, there's 2 people in here. That's more than I expected. How many of you know anybody who's a full-time independent open source developer? So I know a couple. I contribute to them on Patreon. They get paid for bug fixes and other projects. There's a few people that know some out there. They're out there. I really respect them. What about full-time independent open source designers? I don't believe you. There's like 2 hands up anyway. So if we value design so much as a community, where are all of the designers? And this is where I think a discrepancy emerges. People think that they value design and open source, but in practice, we don't see a lot of designers in this community. As you saw, maybe 95% of you raised your hand to identify as developers. Maybe 10% of you raised your hand to identify as designers, probably even less than that. And I think that this is a 2-part problem. Part 1 is that many people still either have a preconceived or outdated idea of what design is and how it can relate to open source, or even just business and technology in general. And then part 2 is that we still haven't figured out how to seamlessly blend design and development. This is sort of a workflow problem. So how can we bring designers into this open source community in a comfortable way that aligns with their workflow? A workflow that's built around our needs in this room. I think the design community also has some things to work out, such as learning to work more openly, but I'm here talking to this massive group of open source developers about an impact that we can have here. So first I want to tackle part 1 of this issue and discuss what design can really be for open source, what it can really mean. Design is mathematical and it's measurable. This is something that businesses need to understand and leverage. Design is not just visual. Design is systematic and precise. Design systems drive growth. And the design thinking process makes sure that we're building the right tools in the first place. This is all measurable. It's not just fluffy and subjective bullshit. And this is where design thinking comes in. It's an approach pioneered by the Stanford D School, which has spread and it's being implemented in many workplaces now, including somewhere that I used to work, IBM. I worked on the first iteration of an open source project, the Bluemix design system, which is now Carbon, at the IBM Design Studio in Austin, Texas. And at this studio, we had visual designers, design researchers, UX designers, front-end developers. And every single person who started working at the studio had a 3-month training course in design thinking. It didn't matter what your job ultimately was, if you were doing user interviews or if you were coding all day long. We all learned this system because it's a product lifecycle system, and everyone can benefit from it. It highlights design thinking and how we can inject design into every aspect of the product pipeline and lifecycle. So the steps go as follows. The first thing that we want to do is to empathize with your user and to understand the core of the problem, because too often do we jump to conclusions. The second thing is to then define the problem and to give it a face with real challenges, personas, user flows, scenarios, the ideal of what we want the user to achieve. We then want to share and build upon ideas. So this is a really collaborative step. And then we prototype and test. And once we've learned from these prototypes, we build a model and test it again. And we can measure progress here and improve upon that system. We can see our iterations and how they've continued to improve over time. And this spans to more than just user interfaces. Using this process helps us better understand API design or workflows or how users want to use our projects in the first place. In the open source community, we help people with these last steps, prototyping and testing. We contribute to each other's projects and fix bugs sometimes. Or if we find bugs, we at least report them. We suggest product changes and issues. That's what I love about open source. I can build a library and then have someone open an issue on how to improve it. It's very collaborative. We're ideating, we're prototyping, and we're testing all the time in real time. We're going through a design thinking process, whether you realize it or not. But when you don't provide some time and make time for those 2 or even 3 steps, then you're not going to get all of the results that you can. You're kind of doing this backwards. We're limiting our creative scope. And we might miss something critical because of it. This is a great slide from Kathy Wang that illustrates this really well. Without this abductive thinking, our scope is limited. Our solutions are limited because of it. And this is where the real difference is. And we're having a team of designers make a much bigger impact than we realize. When we design products with only predisposed solutions to problems in our minds, we can't help but have more narrow outcomes. But when we have time to think about what's really going on, we can come up with much more creative ideas, solutions that can make more of an impact and can improve the product more than we originally thought. We can improve the performance of our sites or experience or reduce the time it takes between figuring out what's going on and actually getting started with that product. I'm giving a talk later today about how to create successful design systems, and I think design systems are just one example of clear benefits of design within a project. When I was working at DigitalOcean, we had created a design system to not only make the UI more consistent and prevent visual bugs and UI bugs on the site, but we also made the website more performant while we were at it. We measured the before and after of implementing our design system into a new website build, and we found these results. Because we were able to reduce code cruft with a more streamlined design and consistent components, we cut almost 2 full seconds from the website's time to first view. The speed index went from 4100 to 1600, and there was no other change in the technology or framework of the site. It was purely just the design system and redesign. We reduced over 2,000 rule sets and over 100 unique colors on the site. We tracked accessibility errors and saw them go down as soon as we implemented the new design system. This is a Pally dashboard. It's PA11Y, and it's an open source tool that you can set up to get real-time results for your own websites of the accessibility of that site and all the errors that you have. This was a design process that we went through, and the results speak for themselves. Design defends the user. The core of product design is to think about the user and to be the user's voice. Designers think about how we can give our users the best experience possible and how we can be as inclusive to our users' needs as possible. To be fair, design can be exclusive. We can create crazy parallax sites and animations and text on images. But with design, we can also be very inclusive and ensure inclusivity from the start. What does this mean? This manifests in a few ways. The first is ensuring accessibility. ensuring that a website's designs and layouts can be navigated by all users regardless of how they use their computers, whether that be keyboard navigation, ARIA roles for screen readers, and accessible colors. They all fall into this bucket, and it's a really important big bucket to understand and think about when you're doing design. The next is ease of use. How easy is it to get started? How tangled is the user journey from point A to point B? Doing some of that design thinking definitely helps us here. How easy is it to get started and then build upon once we've started? An example here is a CLI tool or a framework or like a click to deploy button. It's how easy is it to integrate with GitHub or another tool they're expecting a user to use? And finally, how easy is the documentation to even understand in the first place? How easy is it to look back through as reference? Or is it confusing and missing information? What happens after the first hello world example? What happens next? Where does the user find that information? When it comes to clearer documentation, making things more understandable for one user makes things better for every single user. Where can you have interactive demos or diagrams? Those things help us all. They help us process information. They help us with our cognition. Design is what drives adoption. Design is so critical in open source because design is the very thing that drives adoption of most products. And it could be the thing that makes the biggest difference here. Now, I don't want to get into a nationalistic debate about Apple versus Android. But it is true that the reason that most people who choose the iPhone over another device is primarily because of the ease of use of its software, the user experience, the way that they don't have to set up their phones to their needs. It's this convention over configuration mentality that's helped Apple reach the market share and audience that it's reached today. Even though the technology of Android phones often outperforms Apple's features, 44.5% of Americans still choose Apple over Android. The iPhone XS is way more expensive than the Pixel 3, with a worse battery life and an arguably worse camera. But so many people still choose that phone because the software experience is better. What makes someone choose one library over another could be that experience layer. Does it align with their development needs? That's part of it, but also how does the developer experience work? How does the developer use the product? And how easy is it to get started? All of these things are part of design. The Sass community is a great example of this. Sass is a CSS preprocessor which allowed for early uses of variables and functions within CSS and a lot of other tools like nesting declarations. Now, there were a lot of other CSS preprocessors at the time, like Less and Stylus, that essentially did the same thing. But Sass became the most popular because they designed the product to their audience's needs. What Sass did was, even though it was originally written in Ruby, they soon provided a CSS-like syntax so that style sheet writers would feel at home. You could write CSS files with some Sass mixed in instead of having to write entirely new documents. This, coupled with a building community around the project, is a huge reason for its success. It's such a simple thing, but Sass tailored its product to its users' needs. They thought about the user experience over everything else. Design is not just visual. Design is how your product works. Design is how you enable users to use your product. But design is not all business. There's a lot of value and utility in visual design, even when it doesn't appear so. Design is delightful, and having beautiful aesthetics makes us happy. Seeing a clean website not only helps us cognitively process that information, but it also just lets us enjoy the time on site. Having a little gopher mascot makes us smile and gives an emblem for us to hold on to, an identity as a community. This little gopher mascot, believe it or not, drives adoption of the open source project Golang. The stickers that are made open up conversations. The conferences and meetups that happen are all branded around this little gopher. And look at how many there are. These are examples from all around the world. There's meetups in Stockholm, Pakistan, London, conferences that bring people all over the world together. There's plushies, pins, stickers, illustrations. Thank you to Renee French for designing this gem, and Ashley McNamara for doing hundreds of these gopher designs. This is some of her work here. And it's not just Go, it's Ember 2 and React and even GitHub itself. Did you know there's an entire Octodex of these little Octocats that are user submitted? They're really fun to look at. They're so cute. Design is so much. It's APIs and user flows. But design is also a cute logo that makes your product more memorable. From every angle, design is centered around human understanding and cognition. How we learn, how we remember, how we feel when we use a website, a framework, a CLI, an API. Design is psychological and mathematical and silly and fun, and we need design in order to have a richer open source community. We need design here. We need more designers here. If you're a designer, we need you. If you're a developer or a project manager, we need you too. Introduce your friends to open source. Get the designers on your team involved. Make time for design thinking in your open source process. Make time for ideating and understanding the core problem you're trying to solve and figure out your user base. While you may think it's you, it's not just you. And like many of you, I'm also a developer who has built products for other developers. People never use it like you thought they would. People will always find other ways to use your product. And welcome that as an opportunity to grow your product. Welcome designers into your process. Be friendly, be open, be kind to designers, especially first-time contributors. Understand that their experience is different than yours. And of course, not going to understand all the nuances of Git right away. Because it boils down to this. Right now, design in open source is an unsolved problem. And it can be a chicken versus egg problem. Which came first? An open source development community that wasn't built for designers, or a design community that wasn't predisposed to open source work? I don't have an answer for that. But what I do know is this. The only way that we can grow this community is to introduce it to others. The only way to grow a technical community is to introduce it to people who are not already here. It's great to network with each other, but make sure that you remember to take what you've learned here and to teach somebody else. Somebody who isn't here this year, but could be here next year. Somebody who wants to help but doesn't know how. Or someone who's never even heard of open source before and never knew that they could be a part of this community in the first place. We can teach each other, and we can make this a more diverse network of people that are building the web together. Thank you.